Joe Rogan has built a reputation as someone who doesn't shy away from asking the hard or uncomfortable questions. On his podcast, he's had everyone from scientists and fighters to politicians and comedians in the hot seat. His approach is often blunt, sometimes skeptical, but always curious. When Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett joined him for an episode, it was clear early on that Joe was trying to get a read on who she really was. There had been buzz online claims that she was more style than substance, more soundbite than stateswoman. As usual, Joe didn't ignore the noise. Instead, he leaned right into it. About halfway through their conversation, after touching on topics like congressional gridlock and media spin, Joe shifted gears. With his arms crossed and his tone casual, he asked, "Look, no disrespect, but a lot of people out there are wondering what makes you qualified to be in Congress. I mean, what's your background really? How'd you even get here?" It wasn't meant to be a personal attack. Anyone familiar with his style knows that. Joe often voices the skepticism his audience might be feeling. It was the kind of question he'd ask anyone in power. Still, it hung in the air for a second longer than expected. The framing of the question wasn't just about Jasmine Crockett. It reflected a broader tension around how politicians, especially younger ones, and particularly women of color, are perceived in the media. There's often an undercurrent of doubt, the sense that some figures are more about headlines than hard work. Joe, whether consciously or not, was voicing that cultural skepticism in real time. What made the moment so interesting was that it wasn't hostile, it was almost clinical. Joe wasn't trying to dunk on her. He genuinely seemed to be asking, "Are you the real deal? Or just another flashy politician riding the wave of social media fame?" He wanted to cut through the branding, the Twitter clips, and the media spins to get to the core of who Jasmine Crockett actually was. His listeners, too, were likely asking themselves the same thing. Some had probably never heard of her before. Others may have seen viral moments, fiery speeches, clips from committee hearings, or passionate rebuttals, but hadn't taken the time to learn about her credentials. The moment Joe posed the question, he was giving voice to that curiosity, that doubt, that common refrain. "Okay, but what are her actual qualifications?" It's worth noting that Joe has been critical of politicians across the board. He's pushed back on liberal and conservative guests alike. For him, titles don't mean much unless there's substance behind them. So when he looked Jasmine Crockett in the eye and asked her to account for her legitimacy, it wasn't a gotcha moment, it was a challenge. The kind of challenge he poses often, but one that hits differently when directed at someone who, for various reasons, already faces extra scrutiny. And to be fair, it's a question that should be asked of any elected official. Voters deserve to know whether their representatives have the experience, education, and track record to handle the weight of the job. Joe wasn't out of bounds in raising the question, but the tone, the context, and the timing gave the moment a charge that couldn't be ignored. It wasn't just what he asked, it was how many others had probably wanted to ask the same thing but never had the opportunity. In that instant, Joe Rogan became a stand-in for the skeptical public, a kind of everyman's filter for legitimacy, and he didn't mince words. The subtext was clear. If you're going to hold one of the most powerful positions in the country, you better be able to back it up, not with slogans, not with partisan talking points, but with real, verifiable work. The question landed with weight, not because it was aggressive, but because it was honest. And honesty, for better or worse, is what Joe is known for. When Joe Rogan leaned in with that straightforward question about Jasmine Crockett's background, he wasn't looking for a polished soundbite. He was looking for substance. That's what has always separated his show from a lot of traditional interviews. He pushes his guests to give something real, something that shows who they are beyond the labels. So when he asked, "What makes you qualified?" it wasn't an attack. It was an invitation to prove herself with more than just titles or affiliations. And that's exactly where Jasmine Crockett delivered. By leaning on evidence and action. Instead of rattling off her resume like a checklist, she went into the details of her work as an attorney. She explained how, before politics, her career had revolved around defending people who had almost no one else in their corner. She described taking on cases where individuals were mistreated by a system stacked against them. These weren't vague claims, they were moments of legal battles where she put her training and determination on the line. As she talked, Rogan listened closely. He's always been someone who respects practical experience over theory, and Crockett knew her strength was showing she had walked the walk. She talked about cases where she had to defend people who couldn't afford legal representation, highlighting how often she was outnumbered in the courtroom. It wasn't glamorous work. She wasn't making headlines or gaining fame during those long days and nights of preparation, but that grind built her reputation as someone who fought for fairness, not just for herself, but for those who didn't have power. For Rogan, who often critiques politicians for being disconnected from everyday struggles, hearing these specifics hit differently. It wasn't just a claim of being for the people, it was evidence that she had been in the trenches, doing the work before stepping onto the political stage. What really made Rogan pause was when she connected those experiences to why she ran for office. Crockett explained that after years of working on the legal side, She realized too many problems started higher up, at the policy level. She told stories of clients whose lives were impacted by laws that were poorly written or unfairly applied. And she admitted that she reached a point where fighting case by case wasn't enough. That's when she made the jump into politics. For Rogan, this bridged the gap he was probing. The credentials question wasn't about a law degree or a title. It was about whether her path made her capable of contributing meaningfully to the national conversation. Asterisk as she laid this out. Rogan nodded, noticeably quieter than usual. He often pushes back, challenges, or even interrupts when he senses vagueness or a lack of clarity. But here, he let her speak. She had provided the kind of direct evidence he values, the kind that doesn't leave much room for argument. Crockett didn't need to raise her voice or exaggerate. She simply painted a picture of her career, step by step, and connected it to her current role in a way that answered his question fully. Asterisk. Rogan even admitted during the exchange that he hadn't known much about her background before. That moment was telling. It showed that, while he may have been skeptical at first, hearing the details shifted his perspective. He couldn't dismiss her as just another politician using broad language. She had receipts, and those receipts were the stories of real people she had defended and real systems she had challenged. Asterisk. What made it powerful was that she didn't just talk about what she believed, she talked about what she did. And that difference mattered in front of someone like Rogan. Evidence in action carries weight, especially in a space where conversation is unscripted, and where the host thrives on pressing people who can't back up their claims. Crockett didn't just back up her claims. She turned the question into an opportunity to show that her career path itself was her qualification. By the time she finished, Rogan had nothing left to challenge. He had been given exactly what he asked for, proof through lived experience. Asterisk. When Joe Rogan asked Jasmine Crockett about her credentials, he expected a clear explanation, but he didn't expect the depth of what she shared. Rogan is known for pressing his guests, sometimes to the point of discomfort, because he wants to see if what they're saying can stand up to scrutiny. But what unfolded during this exchange was something different. Instead of pushing back or challenging her story, Rogan found himself listening, nodding, and eventually giving her the kind of silence that spoke louder than words. That silence wasn't about defeat, it was about respect being earned in real time. Asterisk. Crockett didn't posture. She didn't flex political buzzwords, and she didn't demand that Rogan or anyone else validate her. She simply laid out her history, her work, and the reasons behind her decisions. And she did it in a way that made it difficult to question. For Rogan, who often criticizes politicians for being detached or rehearsed, this was a surprising moment. He was hearing someone who was grounded in real-life experience, who wasn't just another voice trying to score points. That's what made him stop talking and really take it in. Asterisk. Respect in Rogan's world isn't something you get automatically. Guests on his podcast, whether they're politicians, scientists, or celebrities, often have to fight for credibility. He tends to interrupt, poke holes, and look for inconsistencies. That's his way of testing whether someone is authentic. But Crockett's delivery left him with nothing to poke at. The way she explained her path, connecting her legal work to her role in Congress, carried the kind of weight that doesn't leave much room for rebuttal. Rogan recognized it, and his quiet acknowledgement was evidence of that recognition. Asterisk. When she described the clients she had defended and the injustices she witnessed firsthand, Rogan didn't try to counter with statistics or anecdotes of his own. He leaned back, listened, and let her build her case. In his own style, that was a form of endorsement. He wasn't just giving her space because she was a guest. He was giving her space because what she was saying made sense and didn't need to be challenged. That's rare for him, and viewers who are familiar with his show would have noticed it immediately. Asterisk. What's interesting about Rogan is that he often plays the role of skeptic, especially with politicians. His audience expects him to cut through anything that sounds rehearsed. But in this case, Crockett didn't give him the chance to be skeptical. She filled in the gaps with specifics and clarity, the very things Rogan usually has to drag out of people. The result was that instead of trying to outmaneuver her, he gave her what many would consider the ultimate compliment: silence. For someone who thrives on conversation, silence can be one of the strongest signals of respect. Asterisk. There was even a moment where Rogan admitted he hadn't known much about her past work before. That admission wasn't small, it showed humility. And it also showed that he had been moved enough by her explanation to acknowledge his own lack of knowledge. In that moment, the dynamic shifted. It was no longer a host challenging a guest's qualifications. It was a conversation between two people where one had proven her point so thoroughly that the other had no choice but to respect it. Asterisk. Crockett didn't press the advantage either. She didn't gloat or try to make Rogan look uninformed. She simply continued explaining herself in the same calm, measured tone. That composure made the respect even stronger. Rogan respects fighters, but he also respects people who don't need to swing unnecessarily. She earned his attention, and by extension, his acknowledgement, by showing she was confident in her story without trying to dominate the exchange. Asterisk. For Rogan's audience, this was a striking moment. They're used to seeing him spar with guests, push them into corners, and challenge everything they say. To see him sit back, nod, and admit he was impressed by Crockett's evidence was a departure from the norm. It wasn't about him conceding a debate. It was about him recognizing when someone had given an answer so grounded and authentic that it couldn't be challenged in good faith, that's not defeat, that's earned respect. By the end of that part of the conversation, Rogan wasn't trying to move the discussion forward with another sharp question. He was, in many ways, speechless. Not because he didn't have the ability to respond, but because the right response in that moment wasn't another question, it was acknowledgement. And for someone like Joe Rogan, who builds his reputation on questioning, that kind of acknowledgement is the highest form of respect he can give. Joe Rogan has built his reputation on long-form conversations that cut past polished talking points and reveal who people really are. His style has always been about peeling back layers, whether he's talking to comedians, scientists, or politicians. That's why his exchange with Jasmine Crockett stood out, not just because of what she said, but because of how she said it. She didn't rely on memorized lines or partisan rhetoric. Instead, she told her story, connecting her personal journey and professional background in a way that made every word feel real. For Rogan, who thrives on authenticity, this was a prime example of the power of storytelling in politics. When he asked her what made her qualified to be in the position she was in, it could have been the perfect setup for her to give a generic response. Most politicians might say something about serving their community, fighting for values, or wanting to make a difference. But Crockett didn't take that route. She leaned into the narrative of her life growing up in modest conditions, working her way through law school, taking on civil rights cases, and defending people who had no one else on their side. She shared moments that were specific and vivid, like standing in a courtroom representing clients who couldn't afford a lawyer, or pushing back against systems that seemed determined to work against ordinary people. For Rogan, who constantly points out when guests dodge questions, the fact that she was willing to be so direct was powerful. She didn't just say she had experience. She told stories that illustrated exactly what that experience looked like. Storytelling gave weight to her answers, and it allowed Rogan and his audience to see her as more than just a title or a label. That's the kind of thing Rogan respects, because he has said many times on his show that people connect better with lived experiences than with slogans. The more she shared, the more Rogan shifted into listening mode. Usually, he's quick to challenge a claim, or to bring up a counterpoint. But in this case, Crockett's use of storytelling left little room for interruption. Each example she gave added another layer of credibility, and each detail built a bridge between her background and her current role. Rogan, who often points out when politicians feel out of touch, seemed genuinely struck by how grounded her narrative was. It wasn't just that she told stories, it was that her stories had a purpose. She tied her past work directly to why she chose to enter politics. She didn't paint herself as someone chasing status. Instead, she presented herself as someone who had seen flaws in the system firsthand and decided to do something about it. For Rogan, who often asks why people go into politics in the first place, this was a refreshing answer. It wasn't abstract. It was practical. It showed motivation that came from experience, not ambition. What made the moment even more effective was that Crockett's storytelling didn't come off as rehearsed. It felt conversational, as if she was walking Rogan through the chapters of her life, rather than reciting a campaign speech. That tone mattered, because Rogan's audience is quick to detect when someone sounds fake. By being natural, Crockett not only won Rogan's respect, but also made it easy for his listeners to connect with her. Rogan himself has often said that stories are what people remember. Facts and figures matter, but stories stick. That's why his own podcast thrives. Guests open up with personal anecdotes, and those anecdotes shape how listeners see them. Crockett tapped into that same principle, whether intentionally or not, by sharing her own experiences instead of abstract arguments. She made her qualifications memorable in a way that bullet points never could. For Rogan, this exchange highlighted why storytelling is such a powerful tool in politics. It cuts through skepticism. It makes a politician human. It shifts the conversation from, "Do you deserve this position?" to, "I understand how you got here." That's what happened during his conversation with Crockett. He started with a challenge, asking her directly what made her qualified. She answered not with slogans, but with stories that traced her journey from defending clients in courtrooms to shaping policy in Congress. The result was that Rogan had nothing to push back on. The story itself was the evidence. In the end, what left Rogan speechless wasn't just the information Crockett provided, was the way she delivered it. Through storytelling, she transformed a question that could have been confrontational into a moment of connection. She didn't just tell Rogan who she was. She showed him, and for someone like Rogan, who has made a career out of cutting through noise to find authenticity, that was more powerful than any political pitch could have been. As the conversation wound down, what lingered wasn't tension or rivalry, but something far more meaningful: mutual acknowledgement. Joe Rogan, who so often plays the role of skeptic and challenger, had found himself disarmed not by clever rhetoric, but by grounded, lived experience. Jasmine Crockett hadn't gone into the interview trying to win a debate. She hadn't tried to overwhelm him with data or statistics. Instead, she relied on the most powerful tool anyone can bring to the table: her story. That story about her upbringing, her years as a civil rights attorney, and her decision to step into politics wasn't just a list of accomplishments. It was a thread, connecting who she had been with who she had become, and ultimately explaining why she was in the seat she held. For Rogan, it was a reminder that credentials aren't always about the titles after someone's name. Sometimes, the truest credentials are the choices a person makes, and the battles they're willing to fight along the way. In his silence, his nods, and his rare admission of being impressed, Rogan demonstrated something that often gets overlooked in political discourse. Respect doesn't need to come through agreement. It comes through recognition. He recognized the authenticity in Crockett's journey, the undeniable evidence of her work, and the clarity of her motivations. That recognition didn't require him to endorse her politics or adopt her positions. It simply required him to acknowledge the strength of her lived truth. What this moment revealed to the audience was the transformative power of storytelling in political spaces. Facts and figures can be argued, but personal stories, when authentic and specific, carry a kind of authority that can't easily be dismissed. Crockett didn't demand credibility. She showed it, and in doing so, she answered Rogan's challenge without ever turning the exchange into a fight. For Rogan, the exchange also offered something important. His platform has always been about digging deeper, about finding realness where others see only surface. In Crockett, he found a guest who understood that instinctively. She didn't resist the probing question of what makes you qualified. She embraced it. By the time she finished her answer, Rogan wasn't left with ammunition for another round of debate. He was left with respect, and perhaps a little surprise at just how compelling her narrative was. For viewers, the takeaway was just as powerful. It's easy to forget that behind the titles, soundbites, and headlines, there are often stories that explain far more than any political ad ever could. Crockett's willingness to share hers turned what could have been a confrontational moment into a defining one. And Rogan's willingness to listen, really listen, showed that even in a space built on skepticism, authenticity still wins. The lasting image from that exchange wasn't of Rogan pressing hard or Crockett deflecting. It was of two people sitting across from each other, one asking a tough question, and the other answering it with honesty, clarity, and evidence. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full of acknowledgement. And in that moment, respect was not given automatically, but earned, right in front of millions.